And welcome. In this processing tutorial, I'm going to walk you through these three photos and how I edited them, and in particular how I use targeted adjustments to affect certain areas of the image selectively. So without further ado, let's get started. First up, we have this nice coastal scene out at Cape Woolamai down here in Victoria. And I took this with a telephoto lens looking down across the coast, and on this afternoon there was quite a lot of sea spray and mist around. You can see it's a little bit washed out. So first up, I'm just going to make some quick exposure and contrast adjustments. So I'm just going to raise the exposure slightly, and as you can see, it's looking a little bit washed out. You can tell that by the histogram. There's not really any blacks in the scene, and then nor is there any whites. So I push the whites up to add a little bit of brightness at the higher end, and do the opposite to the blacks, just adding a little bit of contrast down below, just to bring a little bit of contrast back into the scene. So there we go. Now, the reason I've chosen this photo as an example is I really want to show a color contrast between the warm rocks and the cool water. So to affect that, I'm going to raise the white balance of the entire image, so the global white balance. So I'm going to push up the temperature here up to the yellow, so a bit more warmth in the rocks here, as you can see, maybe just a little bit of magenta. And for all these images, I'm just going to push the edits a little bit further than I normally would, just so the changes do come through in the video. So I'm just going to push up the warmth just a little bit more, just make that a little bit more pronounced. So there we go. So we've raised the entire warmth of the overall scene. So you can see here that the rocks are looking really nice and warm, and sort of that orange red in the rocks. But the problem is when we've affected the global white balance, that's also affected the water down here. So the water isn't as sort of cool or sapphire blue as it could be. So to overcome that, to create that color contrast between the warm rocks and the cool water, so I'm going to apply a radial filter to selectively target the water. So clicking on the radial filter button up here, I can click and drag an oval into position and just drag that down to over the water, just roughly. It doesn't have to be perfect. So if you press O on your keyboard, you can see there where it's affecting, and anywhere in red is where the adjustments will be applied. So you actually see here that the adjustments are going to be applied to the rocks and not the water below. So I actually want to do the opposite and invert that. And now you can see that the adjustments applied just to the sort of inside the oval. But the problem is this is actually quite a jagged cliff line, and there's no clear distinction between water and rock. So what we need to do is use the range mask, and if we come down here and click on color, we can use the eyedropper tool to selectively pick colors that we want to include in the mask, and this will limit it just to the colors that we include. So if I click on the eyedropper tool here and select a blue color down here, you can see that that's now really limited where the adjustments will be applied, and it's excluded almost all of the rocks. So what I can actually do is hold down Shift and click. And if I hold down Shift, you can see there you get the plus sign next to the eyedropper. And what that allows me to do is to build up the mask, actually select multiple colors to include. So if I select one of the more cyans in the water here, you can see it's expanded that to that area. I click on the wider parts here to make sure we're getting those brighter areas in the water. So you can see here there's actually quite a good selection of the water. So if I press O to hide that mask again, now we haven't actually changed anything in this radial mask, but now I can go up to here. Now we've got our selection from the color range. I can go up here and actually cool down the water. So if I bring down the temperature down to the blue, and I'm just going to push this a little bit stronger, nice and blue, and maybe a little bit of green just to bring a bit of sort of cyan into the range as well. So something like that I think would be enough for now. Now if I just turn just this radial filter off and on, if I turn that off, that's without the radial filter. If I turn that back on, that's with the radial filter. You can see it's just affecting the water and it's not really affecting the rocks. And now if I turn this off and show you the overall before, that's where we started before, quite a washed out flat image, and I'll show you the after. you can actually see here there's actually got a nice warmth light in the rocks, and that's actually contrasting quite nicely against the nice blue inviting ocean below. Now, one more quick adjustment before we move on to the next photo. I'm going to go back up to my radial filter and just do a light vignette around the photo to kind of center attention in this central region here. So if I just drag a quick nice radial filter down here, and opposite to before, I want to affect the outside of the image, which is the default. As you can see, it's going to affect the outside here. And I'm just going to bring down the exposure in that just a little bit, just to like that. Feather this out just a little bit more, nice and soft vignette. And now that's darkened the edge of the photo, I'm just going to bring up the overall exposure just to help balance that in the middle. And one more small final adjustment down into the curves layer here. I just like to add a little bit of contrast in those midtones. So just dragging down those lower midtones, bringing up those higher midtones, and just softening those blacks just a little bit. Nice little, very gentle S-curve. And you can see the impact of that. So that's the before without that little S-curve, and now that's the after. And that's pretty close to the final image, so I'm quite pleased with how this one's come out. Now moving to the next photo. Here we've got a nice foggy morning in the Yarra Ranges, and I want to show in this photo how we can adjust the overall white balance to really sort of cool down this nice foggy morning to create that sort of nice moody ethereal feel to this path, but also selectively adjust the luminosity to almost create a nice glow at the end of the path here, helping to lead the viewer's eye up through the image here. Now I'm just going to start with the overall white balance. I'm going to cool this right down to help create that nice sort of moody, cool feel to the overall photo. So there we go. We're going to cool down the overall white balance. I'm not going to adjust the tint for now, but I'm going to bring up the exposure just to brighten this just a little bit. Maybe, there we go. And maybe introduce just a little bit more contrast. And just bring down the blacks just a little bit and bring up the whites to about there. So I'll just show you the before. That's where we started. And this is where we are now, just with a quick little white balance check and just some exposure and contrast tweaks. Now there's a couple of things in this photo that I want to selectively tweak, and I think this is quite a good example to show a few different techniques. So first up, I'm going to zoom down to the grass here, and hopefully it comes through in the video, but I can see there's a lot of orange and yellows in the grass. Now I don't necessarily want that in my photo because I want this to be a nice, cool, lush forest scene. I almost want this to be green down below, transitioning to nice light blue, cool fog above. So what I can do to overcome these orangey, warmer areas in the grass is go down to the HSL sliders down here. And I can take my orange and yellow sliders and move them towards the cooler end, bringing those colors more in line to the green hues. So I can start with my oranges and shift them to the yellow, and then I can take my yellows and move them towards the green end of the hue. Now, just by looking at just these two small sliders, if I turn just this panel off, that's the before, and hopefully this is coming through in the video, and I'll turn this panel back on, you can see here, it just helps make it a bit more uniform and less, I guess, blotchy between the old greens and the oranges. And now it's just a nice sort of lush green through the forest. So that's just a quick little color tweak down here. And now moving back up to the top of the panels here, there's two things I want to tweak. One is I want to draw more attention to the center of the photo, to the center of the path here, so that will mean lightening up this area. Now I don't know about you, but my eyes are actually drifting up to the top of the photo around here. There's actually some really bright areas, so my eyes are actually drifting up here. Now I don't want that. I want the viewer's eyes to almost start here and then lead through the photo and stay in here and then actually wander up to the periphery. So what I can do to overcome that is go to the graduated filter down here and just draw a nice soft graduated filter down like this, and just drag this up so it's nice and soft. Now if I just press O again, you can see where this will be mainly affecting this red area up here. Now O to hide. And I can bring down the exposure on the top of this photo, almost creating a nice vignette at the top, just bringing that down. I'm just going to make this a little bit stronger so it comes through. And you can see here, if I just turn just this adjustment off, that's where we started. That's done. So you can see here, it's sort of darkened that down here to keep the attention in the center of the frame. Now, there's one small issue, is that when I brought down the exposure, not only has it darkened the brighter areas, it's also darkened these tree trunks here. Now, that's not a major issue, but one little tweak that we can actually overcome that and just limit this exposure change just to the brighter areas is like what we did before for color. We can do that for luminosity. So still got this same graduated filter selected. I go down to range mask and now select luminance instead of color. I can limit that change to either the darker areas of the scene or to the brighter areas. So if I actually drag up this slider, what this is telling Lightroom is only apply these changes to the brighter end of the spectrum and ignore those darker regions. So if I actually want to ignore these darker shadows in the tree trunk, I can drag up the slider and say don't affect those darker areas. You can see here that tree trunk has actually now returned to the same exposure as it is down here, while we've still kept the exposure changes to the brighter areas. So if I press O on the keyboard, you can see here that it's not affecting this as much. If I go and undo that and just bring that down, you can see here it's quite strong on these darker trees. But if I selectively drag that up, it's now removing those areas from the mask, and now it's mainly affecting just those brighter areas in the fog. So if I turn that off and on, you can see here it's just darkening the top of the image. So I really like how that's sort of helping to draw attention down to the center here. And then in combination with that, we can also use a radial filter to select and drag a nice oval into the center of the frame here and just brighten this area just slightly. So as you remember, when we press O, you can see it's affecting the outside, so we'll do the opposite and invert that. Just brighten the center of the image here, press O to hide, and just bring up the exposure just slightly in that central region. Doesn't need to be too strong, I think that's enough. So one last thing is I might actually do the radial filter again and do a nice soft vignette around the outside of the photo, and actually want to affect the outside here, so I won't invert the mask, and just bring down the exposure of those outside corners. And like we did for the graduated filter, I can actually exclude the darker areas from this mask. So go to luminance, press O to see what we're affecting, and just limit it to those more sort of mid-tones and brighter areas, and not including those darkest blacks in this mask. So if I turn that off, and I'll show you the overall before, this is where we started. And you can see here, once again, this is quite a flat scene, and you can see here that there's no real central focal point to the image. We'll show you the after. This is where we get it to. You've got this nice sort of bright area in the scene. It's all nice and cool and lush. There's no orange or yellow patches in the grass here. It just helps to make for a nice sort of overall pleasing scene as you sort of make your way through the photo to this central region down the end of the path here. So now I've made those adjustments, I might just fix up the crop. So I'm going up here to the crop and just bring this in, just make it a little bit more level here. You can see these trees on the right aren't quite vertical, so that's no worries. We'll just go in like that. And I might even just crop up some of the bottom here. So there's no real interest down the bottom here. So if I just bring in like that, bring that down and just make this a little bit tighter on the central part of the scene. I think that's enough. Go enter. And one last thing, I'll just pump up the vibrance just a little bit to make those greens a little bit more lush and just make that a little bit more punchy. So there we go. So that's pretty close to the final image there. So just looking at the before and then the after. A nice sort of cool, lush, moody morning fog forest scene. And lastly, let's take a look at this tree image here. Now, on first impressions, you're probably thinking this is quite a dark, underexposed image. If you actually have a look at the histogram here, you can see that even though the majority of the image falls into the blacks and shadow range, there's actually quite a few highlights, particularly where the morning sun was hitting these leaves. So if this image was any brighter, these areas would actually be blown out and overexposed. So that's why I underexposed the initial image. But what we can do to overcome that is just to bring up the exposure now. So bring that up maybe almost, I'd say, a bit over a full stop. I think that is enough. And bring down the whites so these aren't too overly blown out. So I can bring down the whites like that. And maybe even lift the blacks a little bit, just add a little bit more detail into the tree trunk here. So if I just lift up the blacks, just bring a bit more detail back in those dark areas. So there's our basic exposure and contrast tweaks again. Now for this image, I'm going to crop in a little bit. I can just see that there's a little bit of a tree crouching down over the top of the frame here, same as below here. And there's also quite a white light branch in the background. I find that a little bit distracting. So we're just going to crop in just a little bit. So get our vertical alignment right, so make that tree nice and upright. And then just bring in the crop just to exclude those overhanging areas and those areas on the side, just like that. Just bring this up. Doesn't have to be perfect. I think there will do. Okay, so after those exposure and contrast tweaks, I'm going to affect the overall global white balance and color. And this is kind of my sort of general processing workflow, is to look at the exposure, look at the contrast, if it is to be more contrast or less contrast. If it's quite high dynamic range, as is in this scene, we've got the whites and then the blacks, so actually make it less contrasty, bringing up those blacks so it's less contrasty, adding more detail in those dark areas. So that's what I'd recommend, is just look at each photo individually. So with this seascape scheme, this was actually quite washed out and quite flat, and we didn't have much contrast. So actually need to push down the blacks to add more contrast in this quite misty seascape scene. Whereas for this tree image on sunrise here, it's actually quite bright in the brighter areas and quite dark in the darker areas. So actually doing the opposite, actually removing contrast to help expand that dynamic range. So now we've made those exposure and contrast tweaks, I'll now look to adjust the overall colors and white balance. So I want to go for a really nice, lush, green, vibrant morning forest scene. So just bringing down the tint to make it green all overall. So just bringing down that like so. And I might adjust the temperature individually. I'm thinking for this image, I'll warm up this sort of left-hand side where the light's coming in, and maybe cooling down the shadows just slightly to get that sort of contrast between warm light and cooler shadows. And I'm just going to pump up the vibrance just a little bit so you can see where these colors are in the video. Now, the first thing that grabs my attention looking at this scene are these orange red dead branches here and down here. If I zoom in, you can see it's actually quite apparent that even though the background of the photo is quite green and cool and yellow, I've actually got these oranges and reds in these dead branches. I actually find them quite distracting. So what I can do is go down to the HSL slider like we did before for that path image, and instead of actually adjusting the hue, I can bring down the saturation in those reds and oranges. Because they're not present in the rest of the image, I can make this global adjustment, and this will help tone back these dead branches here. So if I bring down the saturation in the red and then bring down the saturation in the orange, you can see here that helps to mitigate these branches here. So if I zoom back out, if I turn this panel off, that's the before, you can actually see there's quite a lot of oranges and reds down here. And I turn this panel back on, it just helps to hide those. And then after we've made these adjustments, we'll do our normal vignette around the bottom sort of corner of this image, and then help to darken this area further, drawing less attention to that. So now I've dealt with those dead branches, what I want to do is add a nice bit of warmth and glow to these brighter parts of the sort of the top left of the tree here. So using our Radial Filter, I can select and drag an area roughly over the tree like so. It doesn't have to be perfect, so I'm going to feather this in. I think that's a rough area, so we want to affect this rough area in the tree. So just reset the exposure. We want to invert that, pressing O to affect the inside of the tree. Now what I'd like to do with this Radial Filter is to lighten up these tree branches around this area and to warm them up as well, to really enhance that nice golden sunlight coming through in the scene. So bringing up the temperature, I can add a lot more yellow to that. Just once again, it's a little bit stronger for the video. A little bit of magenta just to create that separation against those other lush greens, and bring up the exposure just a little bit to really make that glow. So if I just turn that off and on, you can see what that's done. Now what I actually want to do is I don't want to apply this to the very whites. I don't want to apply this to the very brightest parts of the image. I almost want to apply this to the upper mid-tone, so it's affecting the tops of the tree branches here, particularly where these ferns are growing on the tree. I really want to make these nice and golden, but not necessarily the brighter parts behind. So using our range mask, I can go to luminance And just going down here, what I can do is drag these sliders in from either end and almost affect these upper midtones. So I don't want to affect the very blacks because they're in shadow, so they wouldn't be getting natural sunlight. So I can just limit that up to there. And I don't want to affect the brightest highlights either. So by dragging those highlights down from there, you can actually see that it's removed this area from those adjustments. Now if I press O, you can see here it's actually not as strong here anymore, and nor is it as strong in the black. So I can probably bring those blacks up just a little bit to help really rein in where these adjustments are being applied. Now if I turn this off and on, you can see here to add a nice, soft, warm, glowing light to these upper branches up here. And I'll probably do the opposite and just sort of darken the bottom corner of the photo like this. Radial filter again, as you can see here, I do like a good radial filter, and just drag this nice and soft. So we're not affecting this area, but we're actually just affecting the outside around here. So just dragging it up from there. We've already got our exposure preset from the previous one, and just dragging that down. And what we can do is maybe exclude the darkest parts so it's not too harsh in those blacks. Once again, going down to range mask, luminance, and just limiting it away from the darkest blacks and the shadows. And now just affecting those lower midtones and highlights, and just showing the before and after to those radial filters. Now if I turn that off, one last thing I might do in this photo is actually cool down the shadows just a little bit, going down to the split tone module, just going down here, affecting the shadows. And what this is effectively is a luminosity mask to the overall scene, like we had before in the radial filters. This just applies color to the shadows or the highlights. So if I select the shadows, select a nice cool blue around the sort of 240 range is good, and to bring up the saturation just a little bit to cool down those shadows. And what we might do is do the opposites, introduce a little bit of warmth to the highlights just to get that color separation, add a little bit of yellow warmth there. It doesn't have to be too strong, just pushing that just a little bit stronger so it comes through. There we go. If I turn that panel off and on, it's quite subtle, but it actually really does warm up these brighter areas. It helps just to cool down those shadows, just to help get that color saturation through the photo. And lastly, just adding a little bit of mid-tone contrast like we did in that first image, bring down those lower mid-tones, bring up those brighter mid-tones, and just softening those blacks a little bit, just fading them away. Now this is actually looking a little bit too dark overall. We can just solve that by bringing up the exposure just a little bit further so you can see there. So now looking at the before, that's where we started, and this was quite underexposed, but the colors were quite flat. And now looking at the after, that's where we've got it really adding that sort of that transition from dark to light, but also from cool to warm in these warmer areas where the light's actually hitting the tree. So that about wraps things up for this processing tutorial. I hope you learned a thing or two about how you can selectively target both light and color in Lightroom here. And not only how you can just change those, but why you might change those, why you might brighten and warm up those lighter areas, and why you might enhance that color separation between the cool water and the warmer rocks here to help this image maybe align with a complementary color harmony. We've got colors on the opposite side of the color wheel, and then how you might help to rein in the photos. So in this example, it was a bit more of an analogous color harmony. We've got our nice sort of cool greens transitioning up to our cool blues in the brighter parts of the fog. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you like this video and you want to see more, please do like and subscribe to see future videos. But until next time, take care.